Henrichs dearly because he's such a warm, good person, and he has a love for travel. He has traveled many years, many interesting places, and for some reason, he has this great love of Germany, being a Lutheran pastor with a name like Henrichs, and he also has a great interest in Russia. You know, he always wants to buy Russian stocks for some reason, and I just keep trying to hold him back, you know, from buying Russian stocks. But he's going to tell us today about a trip that he made not too long back to Russia. Thank you.
That's about as best I can do as far as... I got these pictures from a internet page, a photograph. These are slides. This is ancient technology that I really apologize for that. But the first few pictures are from a internet site from a museum, taken from an art museum that we saw and heard a concert on our second night in Moscow. And it speaks about... Okay, very good, very good. We'll have to focus it there. You're right, you focus it.
You might want to lower it just a wee. I'm afraid that I can do it when it. Yeah, that way. Okay. Thank you. I'm going to turn this here.
But the name of the painter is Ilya Glazunov, and a famous Russian painter that Vladimir Putin is a great admirer of his, and he was a Christian, very zealous and an Orthodox Christian. It's interesting that I read an internet article a few months ago saying that Russia is the most Christian country in Europe, and you can't see. I'll get a chair here. This is fine. That Russia is the most Christian country in Europe. I think it's 58% Christian, and it is, of that Christianity, I think 53% about our Orthodox Christian, which is an Eastern Christianity. But this is his painting, The Great Experiment, and of course that's a star there, a symbol of communism, and it kind of, what it has there, I know it's difficult to see, it has the communist rulers of Russia, and it has on top of it Christ suffering as the people of, and especially the government of Russia, as they turned into the Soviet Union and became, the official policy was atheist, where they destroyed churches and massacred. It's estimated that about 200,000 clergymen were killed in the Soviet period in Russia. 200,000 were executed, and I'm sure that involves not just Orthodox, but Protestant and even Muslim clerics. There is a picture of, Lenin and... Anybody here been to Russia? Oh, a couple of you have. Well, that's interesting. That anybody here has studied Russian. That, of course, there is Lenin or Lenin, and it shows what the hideous thing in the view of Glazunov, the painter, as well as many, what Lenin brought on Russia. Then this is some of famous Russian. I'm going to see if I can just focus it just a wee bit clearer here. I'll have to wait until we get a real photograph. And that's the desecration of a church on Easter Eve. That's a big holiday in Russia and in Greece, wherever there's Orthodox. It's sort of like a candlelight Christmas Eve service when the church is the fullest, but a fire comes into the sanctuary, is brought into the sanctuary. Everybody has their candles, and that goes from one person to another. But there is the priest sticking out his hand against some communist people have crashed and trying to close down the church service. But the desecration of the church on Easter Eve. And this one is a little close-up of it. The priest. Have any of you ever been in only the two of you probably who have been to Russia have been in an Orthodox church. It's really interesting to go into an Orthodox church, that icons and paintings all over the walls. It has an era. I mean, I've been to a number of Catholic churches in Italy and of course in Germany, but in Orthodox churches, and the Catholic churches do have a sense of mystery more so than many other buildings and churches, but the Orthodox, it's from the tradition, that the background I have as being a Lutheran, that it's almost, well, actually the word is Byzantine, but it's so richly decorated and it's strange, but interesting. The church is there. You know, what they do is, this is again the eternal Russia, and has some Russian saints, and then a Slavic woman that her child is being punished there by some invaders from the Orient, that the sorrows of Russia. It's interesting that I remember in an interview on, I think it was naive as far as their policies. He said they're a generous country, but internationally they're naive on their foreign policy. But he said Russians, the thing about the Russian country, and it was the Soviet Union at the time, is that they have a high endurance of suffering. They can take a lot of suffering more so than other peoples. After all, it was they who in the Second World War lost over all of the casualties. The Second World War, they lost for every, let's see, I don't know how many the total numbers, but it's estimated they lost 27 million people in the Second World War, the Soviet Union. So they were, I mean, they have a vast capability of suffering there. This is, again, the picture Eternal Russia, which has a parade. It's supposed to be a parade, and there are behind a big picture of Christ on a cross there. Again, there it is, yes, that Christ is important for the Russian people and the history of Russia. And this one here is, again, the great experience. No, this is from the one, Eternal Russia. There's, I think Stalin is on the Troika there, which is a Russian cart, a sleigh, that Stalin is there. And this one is, again, the eternal Russia, a couple thousand years of Russian history there. Then that one, another picture there from Christ leading the way for what Russia is and was at its best. And this painting here by Glazunov is called The Market of Capitalism, and I think this was painted in 1999. And what it does is shows Yeltsin there and former President Clinton. What it shows is, and this one theme that a lot of people have in Russia today is xenophobia, that especially from the West, that Western Europe and the United States have a toxic influence on Russia with all of the things. And it kind of, I am not into pop culture, but I know that they have let's see, one of these things here is, I mean, they have Metallica. It's kind of, you can't read. I mean, there's a woman on a motorcycle. They've got, of course, what comes from the West is Nazism and has Adolf Hitler written underlined. Rodina Mat Soviet, that, let's see, rise up for the motherland. It's interesting that Russia refers to itself as the motherland, and of course, Germany, what does Germany call itself? The fatherland. It's interesting, but they have a different view of men and women. That talking about Russian men and women, that Russia has one of the world's, again, according to an internet site, it's the highest difference between women and men as far as longevity, that the average man lives 14 years less than the average woman, and they blame that on vodka, on the heavy drinking that's macho for the men there in Russia. But also, I think it's Russia has 54% is female and 46% male, so it's the male ratio is much lower than the women. I don't know what it is in this country. I just got that figure from the Encyclopedia Britannica handbook this morning. But then this is the one here, kind of, I mean, the influences that the toxic influences from the West, and I think that one is Metallica. Reminds me of one of my 7th grade students that I teach at St. Paul Lutheran School, that a couple years ago, one 7th grader asked me just out of the blue what my favorite rock group of the 90s was. I said I could not even think of one band. And I asked her, what's your favorite rock group of the 90s? And she said Metallica. So that must be pretty out there. But this is the decadence that's from the West. I mean, lesbianism and all sorts of stuff that's coming in there. And that's, again, a picture of the what's interesting is that the painting is 9, let's see, it's 3 by 9 meters. They're huge paintings. I'd never heard of that guy, Ilya Glazunov, and I'd never heard of that painter, but it's really, to me, it was fascinating. And this has this has the New Order of Things in Russian, and of course it's got Stalin, Roosevelt, and I think that's Churchill, but it has all, of course that's from the back of the dollar there, the Statue of Liberty, and of course it's not a very positive view of America. Just reading yesterday from Cambridge Concise History of Russia stated that Americans, at first Yeltsin was very popular in Russia, and then the Americans, President Clinton and the Americans backed him just when he was beginning to fade, and and this book just written a few years ago claimed that many Russians have never gotten off. They felt disappointed in America when they were having their crisis in the early 1990s. And this is again the painting of, and it's surrounded. It's surrounded all by representations of U.S. dollars. So then now that gallery is in Moscow. This is the Duma. This is the Parliament, one of the houses of Parliament, and actually it came back and it hadn't been going since I think 1917. The communists did away with it, and Yeltsin tried to restore that. Well, he did in 1991, but this is their Parliament building, their Duma. That this is apartments in Moscow, and that again, it's not the clearest of pictures, but it's fascinating that I think 95% of Muscovites live in apartments. I think I read only 5% of people in Russian big cities live in their own homes, whereas 95% of the people live in apartments. But they're better than they used to be. I remember in St. Petersburg about 8 years ago that the tour guide said that a lot of those big apartments, old apartments in St. Petersburg, that they had 10 families living on a floor, and they all had to share the same bathroom and kitchen. That, can you imagine your wives, can you imagine the household cook having to share a kitchen with 10 other families? So it's got to be unreal. This guy, I guess it's Marshal or General Zhukov. He was and this is in the Red Square in Moscow. Again, I apologize for the picture. Of course, that is their National Museum of History. They're not national, but their Museum of National History of Russia. And that Zhukov was the leading, I think there was a book written recently about him called Stalin's General. But one of the most memorable things about him, other than his ability to survive Joseph Stalin, who supposedly that 75% of the Russian military people before the Second World War were liquidated or either deposed or killed by Stalin before the war even started. That's one reason a number of historians believe that Stalin made Russia appear to be an easy target for the Nazi Germans. And so that's one reason. Well, some people will blame all 27 million of the Russians who died in the Second World War directly related to Stalin, who had killed historians say 15 million before the war. So altogether 42 million people that lost their lives because of Stalin. I remember hearing in the early 1980s someone say that the butchers of history of the 20th century, Hitler, Stalin, and Mao Zedong, that Hitler, and this is what was described with 6 million, Stalin 10 million, and Mao Zedong 36 million. But Stalin, according to recent historians, many more people died from him. But one of his distinctive features was clearing a minefield. You know how they cleared a minefield in the Second World War, the Russians did? Pardon? They walked the prisoners. So also I'd heard that they'd walked soldiers across it, but you'd heard the prisoners but that's how he did it. They walked them across the minefield and got rid of the mines. But I had not heard that, John. That's interesting. That it was the prisoners they walked across the minefield. But I had heard. Oh, yes. Did someone have their head? Any questions? Someone had their hand in the back there. Yeah. So then we go here. Of course, this is the wall of the Kremlin, and that is Lenin's tomb there. What's interesting is that I believe that is one of those is Christ. One of those is Trinity Tower, but some of them had crosses, but a lot of them had double eagles before communism came in 1917. But in the Kremlin, there are many churches, and that most all of the churches they kept during the communist era. Many they tore down in Moscow itself, but many they kept. To me, that building, I would have loved to have gotten in there, is really foreboding. It's built in a classic Russian style, Museum of Russian National History. That's on the northern part of the Red Square there. And I think this is Trinity Tower. We had a tour at night. I wish I had brought my camera at night. Beautiful color red there, like ruby red. This is looking toward the north there, toward the Kremlin. Then that's Lenin's tomb there. There were a few years ago, they were talking about taking his body out, or what one American columnist, Pat Buchanan, said that the wax image of him, that take that wax thing out, but it's still there. It's interesting that one of the tour guides in St. Petersburg said that when she grew up and she was a Girl Scout, they called him a pioneer, that they made tours from St. Petersburg and from all over Russia to see the mortal remains of Lenin, and that was considered, they called it a pilgrimage. That was a religious event, going to see the remains of Lenin. As of course St. Basil's Church there, I think it was finished in about 1550, I think it was 1551, by Ivan the Terrible. That it's interesting that Ivan the Terrible means not so much, I mean, what we would think of someone being terrible, but Ivan, the Russian word is Groznya, is Ivan the Awesome, that people were utterly terrified by him, that he had one of his wives executed. I think he had 7 wives, even one more than Henry VIII, that he had one of his wives was buried alive, and her crime, her offense was that she was considered too experienced on their wedding night. That was her punishment. She was considered too experienced, so that she was buried alive. A really impressive building. I would have loved to have gotten the inside, although I've seen pictures of it. It's not quite as ornate on the inside as it is on the outside. But a symbol of Russian power and in the mystery of Russia. Winston Churchill, I had written it here, should have been able to remember that. He said, about the time, the beginning of the Second World War, he said, Russia is a riddle wrapped in a mystery inside an enigma. Meaning that nobody knew what was going on in Russia and with their government, especially after the purges of the late 1930s with Stalin. And another picture of St. Basil's. This is GUM, the big luxury department store there that only the elite of the Communist Party had in Soviet days. This is a picture of the inside there. This is Raisa Gorbachev's grave, and this is the number 3. This one cemetery here, the New Maiden or Novodevichy Cemetery in Russia, is the number 3 tourist spot. That I don't know what, I mean, the number 1 I think is Red Square and the Kremlin, and I'm not sure which number 2, but this is the number 3 tourist spot. And there is Raisa Gorbachev's grave. And that's the New Maiden Cemetery. I guess it's Russian Baroque. It's interesting that before communism came into Russia in 1917, there were 20 monasteries in Moscow, and I forget, like 150 churches or 200 churches, but after the revolution that they closed all of the monasteries and convents and just a few churches were left. This is Moscow University, and I think it's got 42,000 students. There's a few buildings like that in the Moscow area. It's called Stalinesque or Stalin Gothic. It's kind of a unique figure there. And this is some cemeteries. I think one of the Russian generals. And that's Boris Yeltsin's grave. The Russian flag, the red, white, and the blue. And it's interesting, if you walk around there, you notice right away that there aren't any crosses on the graves from 1917 to the early 1990s. There's no Russian Orthodox crosses there. Again, this is Yeltsin's grave. That's the Orthodox cross. Of course, the pole, and then there's the crossbar. But that is where the title or the titulus was, with Jesus Christ, King of the Jews. And this is where they would rested their foot, and I think one side is supposed to be it's tilted, indicating the souls who went up to heaven, on the other side, the souls headed down for hell. That's what one tour guide said. But that's a typical Orthodox cross there. And this is Anton Chekhov's grave. I thought that was interesting, that Russian playwright. I think the Cherry Orchard and the Seagull, plays like that. This is Nikita Khrushchev. I remember him when I was little. I remember riding in buses in St. Louis where it had a picture of Khrushchev, seeing that picture in a magazine, Khrushchev making his fist or pointing, I forget which, but it said, "We will bury you." And I remember he was the one in the 1960s who pounded his shoe at the UN building there. Just pounded his shoe when something was being read that he didn't like. But there is his grave. And what was sad to me is to find out when he was a little boy, he knew the entire Gospel of St. Mark by memory, that Khrushchev did. This is Christ the Savior Cathedral. I think this was finished in 1996. This was built originally and finished about 1850 as a commemoration of Russia's victory over France in the War of 1812. I mean, it took them a long time to build that, but and when it was built, and for many years afterward, it was the tallest structure in Moscow, in the city of Moscow. And in 1931, Stalin destroyed it, and they were going to use ball and wreckers, but it wouldn't work. And they had to use dynamite. And I guess it was for a number of years, it was barren. The place was just a barren field. Then they built, I think Khrushchev in 1956 built a swimming pool there. It was one of the largest outdoor swimming pools in the world. But in 1991, that they were so thrilled that communism had been defeated that they decided, and one of the big advocates and proponents of it was that artist whose paintings I had shown, that Ilya Glazunov, and that this building here cost about the same amount of money, 196 million, as the Emerson Bridge. I remember just about the same amount of money so what it says is that, but there's extremely ornate artwork in the middle of it, and of course the gold plating and all that, but that some people thought it was overspending money, but it was a kind of a statement that communism was dead and that orthodoxy was going to be brought back. And this is a statue on above the entranceways to it. It's interesting seeing, there's a picture of some Muscovites. They've got their high heels that I thought was interesting. I just couldn't resist taking that picture. Then, of course, the ever-present McDonald's. It's kind of faded. Can't even see the golden arches there. But that's a McDonald's there in Moscow. They're used internationally as primarily one reason for their clean restrooms and free restrooms. That is to me, there's almost an evil aura with that building. Anybody know what that building is? Anybody? But it's, yes, the KGB, the Lubyanka prison. That they estimate, the tour book said, the guy didn't say, but there have been hundreds of thousands of people who have been tortured and executed in that building there. You can't go any place in Washington, D.C. and see a place where it's just the feeling of evil. The bus passed by, but I couldn't resist getting a picture of it, that Lubyanka prison, for all the things that went on. I think that during the 1991 period of change when it went from the Soviet Union to Russia and the other republics, that the people tore down the man, Felix Dzerzhinsky, the one who had set up the KGB. And this is the Kremlin, the place where the president lives. This is one of the churches that's on the Kremlin, kind of a plateau above the river, where a place of real secrecy. And I think this one might be the Church of the Assumption, but there were a number of them close together. The bell, I think it was the largest bell ever made, and I think the little chunk that fell off weighs like 11.5 tons, so it's a huge bell there. I think one of the biggest cannons ever made. And I think the balls are like the cannonballs that's never been fired would have weighed about 2 tons. And this is, again, I think this might be where, at the time, it would have been Medvedev lives. Would have been at the Russian, I think, at the time, the prime minister. Now, that's held by Putin. This is a picture of Moscow, how it's growing. And it's one of the most expensive cities in the world, Moscow is. This is pictures of the river, the Moscow River country there. It's interesting. According to our tour guide, this building here was once the steeple of a church or a bigger building, and that it was flooded, and the people didn't even know. The people who lived in the villages did not even know that their area was going to be flooded. It was flooded by a dam, and this is kind of a remnant of it. I think this is the Volga River, and this is Ulich, which is one of the churches there. And again, this is kind of a tourist. There's a lot of most of the places we saw were tourist places, but I think this had been built by Peter the Great in the days of when he was emperor of Russia. This is the inside of an Orthodox church. It's one of the few churches you could take pictures in, and I tried to take a few of it. Again, the ornate pictures on the wall. And Again, I think this is a chapel. I found out what the difference between a chapel and a church is. A chapel is a building for prayer and worship, but it has no altar, whereas a church, to be called a church in Orthodoxy, it has to have an altar. That's one of our servers, that's how she was dressed one evening. It's interesting that Russians, they look different. Some of them have a lot of Oriental, like almost the tatars or Tatars. And she had a little bit of that. Others look like the Scandinavian Vikings, tall and blonde and blue-eyed. This is a monastery here, Saint Cyril of White Lake. That's what it is. Well, my watch says 4 minutes to. So are there any questions? Again, I apologize that the pictures didn't show up more brightly. Are there any questions that anybody has? Yes. Tim. Well, when I was little, I remember. When I was little, I remember that all these things like the Cuban Missile Crisis, our tour guide talked about the Caribbean Missile Crisis, that Russia was always the evil empire, that they were going to bomb this country. There was always it was almost that they were evil and sinister, and that we were to be frightened of them. I guess that's one way it got started. Khrushchev, and it's so different. There's a sense of mystery with Russia. But I remember when I was in 7th grade in a social studies class, I was disappointed when I heard that the Soviet Union had more people than the U.S. did. At one time, they were the 3rd biggest country after China and India, the Soviet Union was. I guess that's one reason that started my interest in Russia. I just think it's a fascinating place. Of course, I've always been interested in Germany because my parents, well, both of them grew up in homes where German was the main language, and whenever they wanted to speak something that they didn't want their children to understand, they could go into German. There was a sense of mystery with that. But Russia it's an interesting, mysterious place. Yes, Ken.
I saw your program in Jackson.
Yes.
Can you describe why Red Square was called Red Square?
Yes, well, originally it meant beautiful square, krasnia. It's similar to the word red. Is that what I? Yeah, it's a beautiful square, but they're very similar in the Russian language. Yes. Okay. Yes.
Well,
John.
You have a very good command of Russian words. Do you speak any Russian?
Well, I've been through. Several years ago I bought Rosetta Stone Russian. I don't have any business interest in it. I don't have stock in it anymore, so I'm not advertising. You can't get me on. But yes, I've been through a couple of the levels of Russian. But it's a very difficult language. Russian is. Someone told me a few years ago that for an American or English-speaking person, that the 4 most difficult languages, world languages to learn are Chinese, Japanese, Arabic, and Russian. They're the 4 most. But it is very difficult language. Yes. Anybody here? Well, I asked the question already, so yeah. Okay, yes, Skip.
How did Russians treat you when they knew you were American?
Of course, most of the people, were tourists, but I tried to learn a few words. But I thought they were very friendly. The ones on the ship, they were friendly. One tour guide said that Russians do not smile at strangers. And even that includes other Russians. Like on an elevator, they will not smile at each other. So they're different. They will smile if they know you, but if they don't know you, they will not smile. Now that was, of course, Moscow and St. Petersburg. What they are in rural. Yes, Steve.
What's the population of Russia now, and what do the Russians, have you get any sense of what they thought of Putin?
Well, it's interesting that the Russian, I just looked again this morning, 142.5 million. Moscow is 11.5 million people. And St. Petersburg is 5 million. So it's a lot of it. Russia is 2 big cities, St. Petersburg and Moscow. Moscow being one of the most expensive cities in the world, but a lot of them do not like Putin. The lecturer on the ship, this was on a ship, that she did not like Putin, that she said there was no choice. Actually, she said that Yeltsin, when he was in his declining health, introduced Putin and basically said here's your new emperor, your new prime minister, your new leader. 25 years in the KGB, but a lot of people don't like him. In fact, and I know my watch says one, that 20, let's see, what was it here about? Oh, 42% of the people between the ages of 24 and 18 want to leave Russia. 42%. That was in an article in the Wall Street Journal, I think, 10 months ago. Well, it's time, Ted. I don't want to be... thank you.